Richard will be one of the many kings and long dead humans that are buried in our churches and cathedrals. He's not unique. But because we have a task, obviously behind the practicalities lie some fundamental questions which we can't do the task right unless we as a group have asked the questions. What does it mean to create a place for a dead body? And what is the place of the dead within the church? In our case, Richard's bones may well be the only bones to reside there. Therefore, there is an effect on the cathedral which we can't underestimate, because it is a place of memorial and a place of hallowed prayer, but it will become a place right at its heart with a tomb, bones facing the east, to Christians, the place of light and the risen Christ. And the bones and the tomb will then, in a very special way, represent the hopes and the fears and the faith of all who have lived and died and prayed in the cathedral, and of the living also, because in bumping into that tomb, we'll be reminded of our frailty, vulnerability and the finality of death. Richard's was a life, of course, lived close to death and cut short. I've heard many an eminent educationist talking about educating children for death. Dr. Lakhani talked about the need to do that very positively. He talked about the need to think about death within life. I think there is profound truth in that we only understand life if we understand death also. Touching on an earlier point, which Karina and Sarah both mentioned about boundaries and where dead are buried, some of the early Christians brought the dead in from the edge of the community, recognising the connection and the community of eternal life between the living and the dead in Christian theology. Of course, we've now diffused that with large urban cemeteries, the new necropolises. But current culture, as we well know, provides other creative resting places, at least for ashes, whether it's granddad's favourite spot, the top of a mountain, or your own back garden, or wherever, if it's ashes. So the dead are then considered in those situations not far away. But I contend that the theology, and I'm with Sarah on this, we have a very muddled view of what's going on. It can be incredibly saccharine, and that is something that we who take funerals often have to deal with. Two more shrine. Well, I have no doubt at all that Leicester Cathedral will be much visited once Richard's tomb's in it. Pilgrims or tourists, they will be welcome. But there will be no shrine, even though some may consider themselves on a Richard pilgrimage. But I'd just like to follow that through a little bit more, because shrines have a long history and the respect for the power associated with the relics and artefacts. For some, it's a spiritual encounter, being close to the holy, touching or even being buried near them. For some, it can help in a journey towards holiness, perhaps some of the special qualities will rub off. And for others, it's a place where the veil between heaven and earth is thin, and the suppliant might feel themselves to be part of that wider community of believers. Others may be asking for help or healing, of course, with God's blessing. For some, it's just giving honour to a remarkable life. Now, we would discourage anyone from seeing Richard in that light. On the contrary, part of Richard's symbolic significance, I would contend, is precisely his flawed humanity. He was like us in many ways. Going on with shrines, though, for a moment, they don't need to be grand tombs with mentioned fingers and clothing. Nor does the sacred place have to be a tomb. You think of the bronze feet of St. Peter in Rome, holy wells, and even modern locations, which by their usage have a special status. My votive candles in my prison chapel became just that, a place of special encounter. Cathedral numbers, I'm sure, will increase, but many will seek solace here, requesting our prayers for them and for others. And in that sense, the cathedral is a little bit of a shrine. Sarah's mentioned Elvis's toenails. I was going to mention similar, actually, because those kind of relics aren't medieval claptrap, are they? And I'm sure there will be a brisk trade in Richard branded goods. We may not be able to get a little bit of his hair or his toenails, but by golly, we'll have a mug or a pencil with his face on it. When, though, planning a recent funeral, I suggested the family this was a committed Christian woman, we might, as Christians do, sprinkle baptismal water or even place a Bible on the coffin. I met with outrage. We're not having that mumbo-jumbo. And yet on the self-same coffin, we had one of her most treasured possessions. That illustrates the kind of muddle that we're in. And I've no doubt that that particular possession will be of particular sacred value to the family for a long time to come. That is a kind of veneration, is it not? Karina mentioned grave goods. When my mother died, my grandson insisted on placing his favourite and most treasured possession, his yo-yo, within her coffin. Why? Because Granny taught him to yo-yo. At the age of 92, was still very good at it, and she might like to play the yo-yo in heaven. Shades of many a tradition there. When early Christianity broke with those, it certainly crept in again. And the challenge for us as clergy and for undertakers as well often is to steer that outpouring of grief along sensible channels. You can't put everything in a coffin. Well, what's this got to do with Richard? He's not going to have beloved artefacts in his ossuary, and he wasn't a saint. But because his bones have gained iconic status in some way, not least because of the nature of his discovery, I think his tomb will be visited with a different mindset than the tombs of, say, King John or other long-dead monarchs. I do hope people don't come specifically to pray at his tomb, but I sense for Ricardians there will be a great pull to be physically close to Richard. Another place. If you bury within a church, roughly speaking, the nearer east you are, the more holy the place might be considered to be. Only roughly speaking, but that's a rule of hand. A church building is rich in symbolism and liturgical drama and movement, notoriously towards the east where the high altar is located, and there's often the steps up for elevation, a sense of moving upward and heavenward. Not so here, of course. But we have, courtesy Nicholson in the 20th century, a formidable screen making a threshold between the chancel and the nave, the medieval division between the laity and the religious. And we know that Richard's original burial was at that kind of threshold place, not in some shadowy corner, but in a time-honoured place of note. If we consider where other kings and people of prestige are buried, some are near the high altar, some are on slabs under the ground, some are in separate chapels, I think where we choose to bury Richard, he would be quite content with, facing close to that part of the building which for centuries has become a sacred and hallowed spot. And as I said earlier, given his tomb will be the only tomb here, it will be a symbol for all and therefore should be clearly visible and accessible while also peaceful and restful. And I hope that we're taking the same care over where to bury Richard as any family might take over the burial of their loved ones. The location and design of the tomb, though, as you can imagine, have been the subject of intense discussion and inevitably differences of opinion. It's a fairly unprecedented situation to be in, reburying after centuries where the architectural and artistic styles and, as we've said, the beliefs of the liturgy have altered. The tomb is not just a memorial, it will be the housing of mortal remains. How do we convey what not only we want to say about Richard, but about life, death and the afterlife? That is the challenge. Bearing in mind that generally, as we've said, we're quite inarticulate about death and what happens after that. Sarah mentioned metaphors. We need to ensure that Richard's final resting place speaks of more than Richard, speaks to us, is intelligible to those of outside and of other faiths. And it needs to speak of our shared human life and the search for meaning. We haven't revealed the final tomb design, but you will know from what we have revealed that we are striving for simplicity, conveying deeper symbolism. And medieval pastiche could have mirrored the tombs of the day, but it would merely have housed the remains, not communicated, as I said, into the present day. And it would have conveyed the cathedral as a place of history, but not of living faith. We want Richard's tomb to be a place of personal encounter with God and with self, and a place to ask questions and reflect. Any tomb facing east in Christian tradition symbolically faces God and will convey resonances of graves opening on the last day. And this monument needs to speak of the beliefs which lie at the core of both Richard's faith and all Christian faith, the sure and certain hope that we live and die before God. So we're hoping that an uncluttered simplicity in the tombstone alongside symbolism may remind us all of some of those deep questions. Some kings, of course, are remembered by a ledger stone. Walk into St George's, Windsor, and you'll know what I mean. Interestingly, taste would seem to be divided on that issue, not just in Richard terms. Routinely now we can walk over tombs in the floor of churches with bones beneath, and many did. But there's also a certain squeamishness about so doing. Walking over the graves of the dead, that's a kind of English folklore with biblical resonances, something we've had to be mindful about. Then the journey. Well, there are those who are so fed up with Richard they'd like to stick him right back in the car park. Legalities apart, that would of course downplay not only his human status, but his kingship and the significance of the discovery. I'm not an expert on the protocols concerning the care of human remains, but I'm well aware that proper practice nowadays is that they must be accorded due dignity and respect, even if they're the mummified remains of a long-dead Egyptian. He's a known individual, and while he's currently a set of bones of considerable interest, in the process of reinterment, he will shift from being primarily, not entirely, but primarily, an object of scientific study to their symbolic reinstatement as the mortal remains of a human and as a king. And we've had to talk, therefore, long and hard about the stages in the journey, noting that there will have to be a symbolic handover of custody and probably a saying of farewell as a major chapter in the Richard saga closes. I say all that because that's a recognition, as have others recognised already this afternoon, we interact with bones in different ways. They're not an entirely disposable object, being the remains of a person. And I just point you to the distress of the families of the disappeared when neither body nor place is known, or the huge memorials to missing dead which serve to provide a physical focus for grief and memory. Because in confronting human remains, we implicitly face the deepest of philosophical and spiritual questions. What is a person? Is the real me contained within my body? Sarah said bodies are ourselves, but I think we're much more diffuse about that question. What remains after death and where? I've done funerals where people are utterly convinced, despite the best of signs, that Granny's up on that star over there. And you have to address that. Christian tradition, of course, teaches that God created the physical body, however, and breathed life into it, which is graphically illustrated in metaphor and symbolism by Ezekiel's vision of dry bones. God creating all of us, bodies as gifts from God and not, as the ancient Greeks might have it, prisons for the human soul. Ourselves made in the image of God. And within there, whether we're Christian or not, within a lot of funeral thinking is a kind of material and a non-material view of humanness. People are quite ambivalent when a death happens. People still refer to the corpse as he or she, and then in the same breath look at the dead person and say they're no longer there. When my mother died, I had her open coffin in her house, and that's unusual nowadays. So people said to me, don't let on when you sell that house, thinking that would put people off, that it was ghoulish. But it can be helpful in a way that sanitising the death by tucking the body away in a funeral parlour does nothing. I'm often surprised, actually, by who will and who will not visit the dead before the funeral takes place. And I think that is something about quite unformed notions of what's going on. People might, in Richard's time, actually have talked to the dead body, and I do wonder what people might have said to Richard's dead body. Perhaps there are some in the university who go and talk to the bones. I don't know. I've certainly met people who've talked to urns of ashes on the mantel shelf. So, Richard's bones will travel both physically and symbolically, during which there has to be a sense of reinstatement, and where his final, rather hasty burial is translated into an appropriate and final resting place. And that's unprecedented. And it's got enormous potential for us all, not just for the ceremony of the day and for the city in terms of its place in the country, but for all of us in contemplating our journeys. Here we have a real-life human being and a king to bury, whose brutal end came in the midst of life and who was unquestionably a man of faith. That compels us to ask questions about forgiveness and redemption, of the nature of leadership, the connections between public and private life, and ourselves. And the same question arises at funerals. The person who died was both saint and sinner, and it's extremely unhelpful when working through the process of grief if you can't hold those two together, that a measured assessment is arrived in good time at what this person means to others. It can last way beyond the funeral, but good practice tries to draw all that together and not just the saintly bits. I found this really stark in the prison because prisoners could not attend funerals on the whole and therefore didn't go through the normal grieving processes with the family. And I often advise those prisoners to find their own symbolic actions when they were released. And I remember one very well who was going to get a bottle of the best brandy and pour it on the grave. Not really as a libation offering, but as a way of connecting, I think, with the dead person and saying what needed to be said. And so finally, to the ceremony. Those of us who take funerals, I think, work hard to hold together the symbolism and the journey, physically the journey, because we're confused whether we're caring for living and dead at that stage. As it states in our funeral rite, we're there to remember the person before God, to give thanks for the life, to commend him or her to God, to commit the body to earth or cremation, and to comfort in grief. And if you miss out too much of that, you can leave people up in the air. The balance can vary. In Richard's case, we're not in grief and it won't be a funeral. Actually, early Christian funerals were quite joyful, and we've touched on that earlier on in other cultures. Extreme Protestantism actually went as far as little or no liturgy. We've talked about how purgatory vanished, but actually with it ceremony vanished as well. And even in our times, you know, stillborn babies haven't received proper funerals until fairly recently, and the consequence effects of that are horrendous. People make choices, of course: burial or cremation, church and or crematorium, committal or separate service, the nature of the wake, and again we've touched on that. And the implication is not always clear when people are making these choices. Let me take one part of that: what you have where. If you're not careful, church and crematorium can feel like doing the same thing twice, doubly piling on the agony, if you like. Having a memorial service without a coffin can be for some entirely positive, others dislocating and unhelpful. And nowadays too, funerals can be quite delayed. That has positive and negative effects within families. Of course, none will be quite as delayed as Richard's reinterment. We also know of societies where double burials carried out, dug up after a while and reinterred, and that might be marked as a new relationship with the deceased, buried as a dead person, reinterred as an ancestor, a turning point in the process of letting go, which in some ways I think people do today with the ashes, because they're not always buried or scattered until quite a while afterwards. May that be a useful insight into Richard's reinterment. He's already been buried. We can't mourn him, But are we reinterring him metaphorically as a kind of, in inverted commas, ancestor? And maybe that might help members of the Plantagenet alliance. Richard will have received Christian burial, however hurried, and that affects our thinking in terms of liturgy, the ceremonies which we do in the church and indeed in other places perhaps. And while it may seem odd to us to dig someone up and rebury him, there is precedent within recent Christian tradition, like in the last few hundred years in Richard's and after Richard's lifetime, and indeed several kings of England have been reburied elsewhere. Alexandra Buckle, we're indebted to her for the scholarly wisdom in making available the reinterment liturgy for the Earl of Warwick, which was in Richard's lifetime, which looks to be a generic one, giving a good pointer to custom and practice at the time. But as with the tomb, we here are not aiming for reenactment, but an act of worship, whose theology is that of a journey from the waters of baptism through life to death and the hope of life eternal. Christian burial for a Christian king. From the earth you formed me, and out of flesh you clothed me. My Redeemer, O Lord, raise me up in the last day. Richard would have wanted and expected his burial to be surrounded by the prayers of the church. This raises interesting questions about language, because we don't speak Latin today and the Vespers of the Dead is not familiar. Also, praying for the dead can be a controversial issue. And again, that's something that's come and gone. It's condemned in the Articles of Faith. It is not condemned by Anglicans per se, but it is not accepted by all. Another point which is often raised, that in law the Church of England is a continuous body since Saxon times, therefore we're the successor of the church to which Richard belonged. So an Anglican funeral is entirely right, however we choose to diversify within that. I say all that because I find it very interesting when taking funerals today that people may be nervous about too much Christian doctrine. Uncle Jack wasn't religious, so let's avoid the topic, but actually need and like a structure which faith can provide, not exclusively, but can provide, not least deep down because there is some inchoate feeling that this person has gone somewhere. And we had one family funeral like that. The family were absolutely adamant that they wanted a non-religious funeral, but actually I went to it because it was a family funeral. It was more Christian than probably I would have done. And the family loved it. So actually what is said and what happens don't always match up, and that's something to do with not knowing what you want. So what we've got to do with Richard is sculpt something which both recognises tradition and Richard's faith, but speaks also to the modern world, and most importantly, speaks to the multi-faith and pluralist world of this city and beyond. My final comment. These are Richard's bones. We know they are. His DNA has been checked. But they also symbolically hold a lot more. They hold the story of an individual. I'd like to say his song, which in so many ways links with our stories and songs, whoever we are. And it is as such that we shall reinter him with dignity and honour. Having been dug up, he will both be remembered and remembered. And then we shall celebrate the legacy of this and our journeys, and it's a long journey, this reinterment process. His journey from death and burial to discovery and reinterment. Our journey too, and a journey from medieval to 21st century, and the legacy that we leave behind.